Hello again to not only the people here and there, but on YouTube. Whenever you are watching this, and let me just head off there we go. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get that up and going. It's optimized for a video clip. Okay, so we're on week number 5 of our Bible study series, deep diving our way through the scriptures. And we will start off this evening with a review video. We talked last week about really chapters 3 through 11 of the book of Genesis. This video is a video about chapters 1 through 11. But it functions very well as a review. So let me just double check that everything is ready to be run where it needs to go. And then we'll push play. So here we go. Hang on. Why are we not having sound? I had this problem last week, didn't I? One of these levels is not ready to go. Try it now, maybe? Nope. Okay. Stop the screen share so that I can see what is going on. Yeah, that should be good. That should be good.
And these two parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of...
Wasn't quite patient enough. It jumped in all on its own. Okay. So let me now get everybody back on the same page one more time. Okay. Here we go. Come on, audio. You can do it. I believe in you. I still believe in you. But I'm losing my hope. Huh. It's a great video, really is. All right, I'm going to try one more thing before we just pull the ripcord and go to plan B. Okay, I'm going to quit this window. Maybe that's giving me troubles here. Stop sharing. Here we go, sharing desktop 2. One more attempt at this noble exercise.
The book of Genesis. It's the first book of the Bible, and its storyline divides into two main parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, which tell the story of God and the whole world. And then there's chapters 12 through 50, which zoom in and tell the story of God and just one man, Abraham, and then his family. And these two parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of chapter 12. And this design, it gives us a clue to how to understand the message of the book as a whole and how it introduces the story of the whole Bible. So the book begins with God taking the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible, and God brings out of it order and beauty and goodness. He makes a world where life can flourish. And God makes these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He makes them in his image, which has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world, and they're appointed as God's representatives to rule his world on his behalf, which in context means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. It's a key word in this book. And he gives them a garden. It's like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world. Now, the key is that the humans have a choice about how they're going to go about building this world. And that's represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up till now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? And the stakes are really high. To rebel against God is to embrace death, because you're turning away from the giver of life himself. This is represented by the tree of life. And so in chapter 3, a mysterious figure, a snake, enters into the story. The snake's given no introduction other than it's a creature that God made. And it becomes clear that it's a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It says that seizing the knowledge of good and evil are not going to bring death, that it's actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. Now, the irony of this is tragic, because we know the humans, they're already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the humans seize autonomy, they take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. The first casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman, they suddenly realize how vulnerable they are. Now, they can't even trust each other. And so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go and run and hide from God, and then when God finds them, they start this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. Now, right here, the story stops, and there's a series of short poems where God declares to the snake and then to the humans the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the snake that despite its apparent victory, it is destined for defeat, to eat dust. God promises that one day a seed or a descendant will come from the woman who's going to deliver a lethal strike to the snake's head, which sounds like great news, but this victory is going to come with a cost, because the snake too will deliver a lethal strike to the descendant's heel as it's being crushed. It's a very mysterious promise of this wounded victor. But in the flow of the story so far, you see this is an act of God's grace. The humans, they've just rebelled, and what does God do? He promises to rescue them. But this doesn't erase the consequences of the humans' decision. So God informs them that now every aspect of their life together, at home and out in the field, it's going to be fraught with grief and pain because of the rebellion, all leading to their death. From here, the story then spirals downward. Chapters 3 through 11, they trace the widening ripple effect of the rebellion and of human relationships fracturing at every level. So there's a story about two brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain's so jealous of his brother that he wants to murder him. And God warns him not to give in to the temptation, but he does anyway. He murders him in the field. So Cain then goes on to build a city where violence and oppression reign. And this is all epitomized in the story of Lamech. He's the first man in the Bible to have more than one wife. He's accumulating them like property. And then he goes on to sing a short song about how he's more violent and vengeful than Cain ever was. After this, we get an odd story about the sons of God, which could refer to evil angelic beings, or it could refer to ancient kings who claimed that they descended from the gods. And like Lamech, they acquire as many wives as they wanted, and they produce the Nephilim, these great warriors of old. Whichever view is right, the point is that humans are building kingdoms that fill God's world with violence and even more corruption. In response, we're told that God is broken with grief. Humanity is ruining his good world, and they're ruining each other. And so out of a passion to protect the goodness of his world, he washes it clean of humanity's evil with a great flood. But he protects one blameless human, Noah, and his family, and he commissions him as a new Adam. He repeats the divine blessing and commissions him to go out into the world. And so our hopes are really high, but then Noah fails too, and also in a garden. He goes and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk out of his mind. And then one of his sons, Ham, does something shameful to his father in the tent. And so here we have our new Adam, naked and ashamed, just like the first, and the downward spiral begins again. It all leads to the foundation of the city of Babylon. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, they come together around this new technology they have, the brick. And they can make cities and towers bigger and faster than anybody's ever done before. And they want to build a new kind of tower that will reach up to the gods, and they will make a great name for themselves. It's an image of human rebellion and arrogance. It's the garden rebellion now writ large. And so God humbles their pride and scatters them. Now, this is a diverse group of stories, but you can see they're all exploring the same basic point. God keeps giving humans the chance to do the right thing with his world, and humans keep ruining it. These stories are making a claim that we live in a good world that we have turned bad, that we've all chosen to define good and evil for ourselves, and so we all contribute to this world of broken relationships, leading to conflict and violence and ultimately death. But there's hope. God promised that one day a descendant would come, the wounded victor who will defeat evil at its source. And so despite humanity's evil, God is determined to bless and rescue his world. And so the big question, of course, is what is God going to do? And the next story, The Hinge, offers the answer. But for now, that's what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about.
I love these videos and the job they do with picturing so much in a short span of time. Thoughts on this before we press forward? This is what we talked about last week. And we ended at the point at the bottom of the middle of this page where sin had shattered the world and God's ordered creation to the point where everyone was scattered all over the face of the world and they couldn't even talk to each other. And the question now that the rest of the Bible really deals with is, what is God going to do to rescue the lost world? And here is where we jump into today. So, any thoughts or questions? I will stop sharing here. Herb, do you know how to mute your microphone? And then if you have a comment to make, I think you can press the space bar, hold down the space bar and talk when you would like to. That'll keep any background audio in your space from leaking onto our Zoom meeting. Thank you very much. If you have something to say, can you test that out? Just hold your space bar down and see if you can talk. No, I didn't hear that. There's some kind of setting. I apologize. There's a way to make that more feasible. But for now, I just wanted to give you the heads up that maybe to keep your audio under.
Just by touching that, I'm on now, and I can mute it again, easy. So
there you go. Okay. Yep. Go ahead and mute your audio for now. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to jump on in. But we will now jump ourselves over to our book material. And Herb, I can go ahead and bring you your own copy of this resource if you are interested, because we have copies of this book here in the room. We have copies down at Trinity and Witt, and I've had a couple people ask for their own copy that they can take with them. So I will just go ahead and take the liberty of bringing you your own copy next time I'm at the Care Center. But for now, all the illustrations are going to be up on your screen as well as ours once I get things going here. Get rid of this. Get this going. Share my screen. Okay. So, for those who have a book, we're starting on page 68. We're halfway through book 1, almost. After today, we will be halfway through book 1. So we're picking it up again right in the thick of things. This is very similar to the last illustration that we left things at the end of our week last week. We took a look, and this is just a quick review. So we will start again with, I will move this down to the bottom, maybe. Up here at the top, let's see if it zooms in at all. No, it doesn't. On our timeline, this is Genesis chapter 1 up here at the top. You can barely make out the creation account, the sun, the moon, the stars, the land, the sea, the animals, the plants, the birds, the fish are in there, and humans are in there too. And at this point, humanity is a very small number. As you take a look, I'm going to move this back up to the top now. As we go towards the bottom of the page, there's these yellow dotted lines. It's hard to make out the color on that wall, but the yellow dotted lines, they expand, they widen as they get closer to the bottom to indicate that humanity is growing and multiplying, being fruitful and multiplying, just like God commissioned them to do. What do we have here? We have the pattern that we introduced last week. Each of these stories, these accounts, follows the same pattern: sin, judgment, and grace. And there's 4 of these stories. The first one is in the Garden of Eden itself, with the fall of Adam and Eve. The second one is Cain and Abel, Cain murdering his brother Abel. The third one is the flood story and those interesting details in there. And finally, we have the Tower of Babel as the final one of these. As we go from top to bottom, there's a triangle that's the other direction, that's inverted. So this one indicates that God is choosing one family out of the multitude. It's focusing our attention, the story is focusing our attention really on this one remnant, this one individual who is called out of the multitudes to be God's rescue plan. They were to be the first of a people through whom God planned to work, to reconcile humanity to himself and to one another in the midst of this world that is so shattered. We have this symbol for sin that comes like a lightning bolt out of right field, and the world is just broken, shattered apart into all kinds of different pieces so that people can't even talk to each other now. And God's rescue plan involves Abraham. The pattern holds true: sin, judgment, grace, sin, judgment, grace, sin, judgment, grace. We have the Tower of Babel as the sinful act. The judgment is God's dispersal of humanity to all the corners of the world. And God's grace in this account, this episode, is one that carries forward for the rest of the Bible story. Does that kind of make sense, the way the illustration is trying to capture this idea? All right. Then please, if you're following along, turn the page. And here we have a genealogical chart that follows the promise that is made back in chapter 3 to Adam and Eve. As you go along, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. There's a lot of names, a lot of references in here, a lot of verses. It starts with Adam, goes through Seth to Noah, goes through Shem and Terah, and then through Abraham, down through Isaac, and then down through Jacob, through the 12 sons of Israel. But also included in here are these other branches. And of note are these other people groups whose origins are noted in the early chapters of Genesis here. These 7 neighboring nations, the Canaanites, the Shemites, the Midianites, the Ishmaelites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, Edomites, and Amalekites. If you take a look forward into the story of when the people of Israel are in the Promised Land, these 7 nations, people groups, made life very difficult for Israel. That's just looking forward. In Genesis, we have their origin stories laid out for us. And interestingly enough, all of them have a less than ideal origin story. For example, the video commented on after the ark made it through the flood, after God brought the ark through the flood, and Noah got off the ark, planted a vineyard, got drunk, and there was something shameful that happened between his son Ham and Noah in the tent. Well, Ham was the father of the Canaanites, and when Noah sobered up, Noah pronounced a curse on the descendants of Ham. The Canaanites happened to come from Ham. So there's their origin story. Others are listed in there. The Moabites and the Ammonites are the descendants of Lot by his own daughters. If you recall that story, after they fled from Sodom or Gomorrah, one of the two, and Lot's wife turned back, inadvisably so, turned to a pillar of salt. Lot's daughters took matters into their own hands, got their father drunk, and took his progeny through themselves. The Moabites and the Ammonites are coming from this incestuous relationship. The Ishmaelites have their own, Genesis 16. Esau was the first of the Edomites, and then the Amalekites. Amalek's father Eliphaz was a son of Esau. His mother Timnah was a concubine of Eliphaz. All of these people groups are not necessarily disparaged, but it does paint a negative portrayal of them. And they're all to be found here in various places. So zoom in, scroll down quickly, in case you need a zoomed in one. Questions on this page?
That explains when we were talking about in our men's Bible study about all these tribes and everything, that so basically they probably all just came from somebody who had that name and had their family or tribe or whatever.
Yep. When were we talking about
at
that?
the men's Bible study, we remember Doug was asking about where all these different, we had the Hittites.
Got it.
And we had
Yes.
and he's,
Yep.
and we were discussing where all them came from.
They're
So
all in here
probably
somewhere.
Just derived from a similar situation like this.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I do have a question though.
Please.
When we were looking at the early video, when he had earlier in the video, they talked about the tree of life
Mm-hmm.
and the tree of knowledge and evil.
Right.
So are those two separate trees, or are we supposed to? Are those one tree
Nope.
that has two?
Those are two separate trees that are named individually.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, what basically then was the tree of life?
The tree of life was in the middle of the garden, and there's a lovely dose of symbolism going on here. The tree of life is often understood to be God's own sustaining power, presence, manifested in the form of a tree. You get the food from the tree. It's basically God's life-giving power. And that's represented in some of their other videos in a really magnificent way. They compare the burning bush to the tree of life itself. They compare Noah's Ark to the tree of life. How God uses tree in so many different parts of our story to rescue people, to bring people, to commission people, meeting people at trees. Is that kind of what you're asking? Yeah.
I was always, I don't know, I was just always under the impression that it was the same tree. The tree
Nope.
of life had the fruit, which was gave them
Yeah.
was the same tree.
Yep. Gave them life. There is, I'm thinking of something, I want to get it right. Where would it be? Verse 9 of chapter 2, out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that's all it says, really. But it's like in the midst of the garden, the middle of the garden was the tree of life. And it's like you had to walk past the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to get to the tree of life. That's just kind of the sense you get. There's also this other tree there. And that tree is got some special interest in our story going on. But yes, there were definitely two trees. Other questions? All right. So now we turn to page 72 and 73. This illustration is an interesting one. The covenant with Abraham is what this page is called. And over and over and over again, not only with Abraham, but also once with Isaac, once with Jacob, at least once with both of those two. And then here, with Abraham, we have Genesis 12, 13, 15, 17, all times where God proclaims what God will do for Abraham and achieve through him. So this illustration lifts up some important details here. If you look at our illustration, does it zoom in? No, first of all, it talks about just what the covenant is. There's 3 parts to this covenant, and that's on the bottom part of our page here. It is a 3-part covenant. First of all, God promises Abraham a large family. He would be the father of many nations, so that's line 2. God would give them land to be their own, so that's this little map part right here. This is a zoomed in picture of the promised land with the Dead Sea down here, Sea of Galilee up here. And down at the bottom, this last part, through Abraham's family in this promised land, God would bless the world. And here's the goblet of wine being poured out onto the world to signify God's blessing of the world. This formula gets repeated each of those times listed at least once to Isaac and to Jacob. It's a very important set of details. Yep, we get that zoomed in, we get that zoomed in, we get that zoomed in. So now it's important to remember that this is the top half of our illustration. We have the symbol for God. This is the God character, represented by a circle to indicate that God has no beginning and no end. And these 4 arrows coming out in every direction indicate that God's actions, God's love, always go out from God to other people. It's in direct contrast to the symbol for sin, which is an arrow going in a circle around to itself. But here, God is represented, and there's an action coming out from God to Abraham. And this is Abraham represented here. He has his hands on his hips to indicate he's not perfect. He's not a holy person. He's just as fallible as everyone else in the world at this time. But the covenant God made was a one-way affair. God was making the promises and was not asking for anything from Abraham in response or otherwise. God simply says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bless you into a great nation. I'm going to give that nation a land to be their own. And through you, I'm going to bless the world. This is called a covenant of divine commitment, according to this curriculum anyway. Now, there's some other interesting details in number 2 that we will get to later on, so we'll skip over that. And we'll skip over number 3 on page 73, because we'll come to that on the next few pages in greater detail. But the covenant sealing ceremony is represented here in the middle, and that's a fascinating story. So what happens is God repeats this covenant formula once more. I think it is in chapter 15, yes. And God performs a covenant sealing ceremony where God calls Abraham to take some animals and cut them in half, slaughter them, cut them in half, and arrange the pieces in rows next to each other. Well, that's interesting, you might say. And then God causes Abraham to fall into a deep sleep. So Abraham is asleep. God's presence appears in these forms with a flaming torch and a smoking fire pot. And there you have the 2 different manifestations that will be very familiar to the people as they're wandering in the wilderness. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. And these 2 manifestations of God's presence, they pass between the rows of animals that have been cut in 2. So, without cheating, what would you guess the symbolism is for that action? Because typically, this is a covenant sealing ceremony that both parties involved would participate in. Both of them would pass between the rows of animals. What are they saying by doing that? And if you do want to cheat, they are saying, may the fate that has overtaken these animals be my fate, if I break my promise to you. I just think that's pretty cool. It's a powerful, powerful statement to make. But notice that God is the only one. Abraham doesn't pass through those rows of animals. God's presence is the only party involved. So God is binding himself to this family, making a promise to them. Questions or thoughts?
Okay, so in the bottom of our book here, it says that Abraham and his descendants will eventually get the land in 400 years' time. Is there any significance to 400 years?
Good question. Other than that's just what it took, according to the account. It is a round number. It's 40 times 10. 40 is usually understood to be a large number. That's the best I can do. The numbers have their own kind of mythos in Scripture. And no, other than it took that long for this to be accomplished. Good question. I don't have a better answer than that, though. Okay. So that's the overview for today. But we're not done. There are 1, 2, 3.5 pages of synopses of these different episodes that happen now from Genesis chapter 12 through Genesis chapter 25 for the rest of the Abraham story. And I would like to, if you will indulge me, I'd like to read through them. I'll read them quickly and clearly, but they are some fun stories. So, we've already read what's at the top of page 74. Great nation, land, and through you I will bless all the families of the earth. The note there, throughout the Bible's big story, there's only one hero, and that is God, who always acts in grace. To work through this story is to be made very aware of the truths embedded in this statement. So God lays out what God is going to do, and then we have all of these different occasions where God proves it over and over again. So here we go. Chapter 12. When making a covenant with Abraham, God commands him to go to the land that God will show him. The 75-year-old Abraham responds by gathering together his 65-year-old wife Sarah and his nephew Lot, and all the possessions that they have gathered, and all the persons they have acquired in Haran. Have you ever noticed that detail before? God calls Abraham to leave his country, leave his family, and go to where God will show him. But Lot goes with him. It's a little bitty detail that might get overlooked, and that's about all it says, but it's kind of a little red flag saying that, yes, Abraham listens to God, but right off the bat, Abraham thinks there's a better way of doing it. This is in verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Had you ever put that together before? Had you ever seen that before? It's just a red flag that's just kind of waving in a very tiny way, but saying, oh, hang on, because it's not all going to be all fun and games. After entering Canaan, Abraham spends some time at Shechem and finally settles between Bethel and Ai. He builds an altar and worships the Lord at both Shechem and the final stopping place between Bethel and Ai. Later in chapter 12, Abraham and Sarah go to Egypt to seek relief from a famine. While there, Sarah finds herself in a rather awkward situation with the Pharaoh. True, the at least 65-year-old ancestress of the chosen people must have been rather beautiful, but the manner in which Abraham extricates himself and Sarah from the situation is not so admirable, even though Sarah actually is his half-sister. The point is, if the Pharaoh had kept Sarah, she could not have produced offspring for Abraham. And remember the promise that God made, that God would produce a family through Abraham. And if Abraham doesn't have Sarah, that's not going to work out very well. So there's cliffhanger number 1. And God resolves this situation. There's so many cliffhangers here, and it names them exactly that. Genesis 13. After escaping from the clutches of the Pharaoh, the patriarchal community returns to Canaan, where Abraham offers Lot, his nephew, a choice of where he wishes to live. Lot can live in either the region to the east of the Jordan River or in Canaan. It's sometimes suggested that Abraham showed generosity in giving Lot this choice. However, does Abraham really have authority to offer Lot the land God has promised to Abraham and his descendants? Had Lot decided that he wanted Canaan, Abraham would have lost the promised land. Fortunately, Lot chooses to live in the region to the east of the Jordan River and breathe a sigh of relief. Cliffhanger number 2. All of these stories have very not so subtle messages like this. God is constantly with 2 hands on the reins at all times, trying to keep the cart on the road. 14, Lot is captured by a coalition of 5 northern kings, and Abraham rescues him. After rescuing Lot, Abraham surprisingly pays tithes to a Melchizedek, who served as both king and priest at Salem, which would later become Jerusalem. There are no laws concerning tithes that have been given as of yet. Is the narrative encouraging later Jews to pay their temple tithe willingly and regularly, even as their ancestor Abraham did? This is an interesting moment that is, again, kind of a car speeding by. You get to see it coming, and then you look at it going, but before you know it, it's gone. It's just a moment in the story of Genesis. And apparently, this was a priest who served God. How he knew about God, we don't know, but he comes onto the scene and then he leaves. But he recognizes that Abraham has the promise of God. The only other mention that we have of Melchizedek is much later on in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, where Jesus is compared to this character. And that's a whole rabbit hole that we could go down, but that would swallow us up big time. Chapter 15, because Sarah has not been able to conceive a child, Abraham suggests to God that he adopt Eliezer as his son. a slave born in his house. God rejects the suggestion and assures Abraham that he will eventually have many descendants as there are stars in the sky. Tablets found at Nuzi in Mesopotamia state that a master could adopt a slave as his heir, which would fit with this story. However, the tablets stipulate that the adopted heir had to yield to a true son born later, which would also fit with the story, with the cultural implications of this day. Here is chapter 15, verses 7 through 21, which is the covenant sealing ceremony. We kind of ran through that one before, so I will skip over that one. Much of it is repetition. Chapter 16, 10 years have now passed, and Abraham and Sarah have no children. Sarah gives her maid Hagar to Abraham and suggests that he raise up progeny through her. Hagar conceives with little difficulty. However, when strife develops between Sarah and Hagar, Hagar is expelled and eventually gives birth to Ishmael. God declares that Ishmael, the product of the union and the father of the Arabs, will grow into a nation of considerable size and consist of 12 tribes. Interesting. Even so, the chosen people will develop from Isaac, whom God will eventually give to Abraham through Sarah. Okay, chapter 17. Any thoughts, any questions, any interesting things that you see so far? We're just zooming through. Abram's name is now changed to Abraham and Sarai's to Sarah. The practice of circumcision is introduced to serve as a sign of the covenant relationship God has established with Abraham and his descendants. And God then promises the 99-year-old Abraham that his 89-year-old wife will soon have a child. Abraham considers the suggestion impossible. He laughs and asks why Ishmael should not be seen as his successor. God responds that the line of promise must go through the as yet unborn Isaac, not Ishmael. Of significance is that Ishmael was conceived while Abraham was in an uncircumcised state. However, Isaac was conceived after Abraham was circumcised. The act of procreation has been marked literally. Thoughts, questions? Chapter 18 and 19, the narrative speaks of Abraham and Sarah practicing hospitality towards 3 important visitors. When these guests tell Abraham that Sarah will soon conceive and bear a child, Sarah laughs. The visitors then tell Abraham of the fate that is about to overtake Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham responds by doing some bargaining. "O Lord, if there are 50 righteous people in the town, will you spare them?" God says, "Yep." Abraham says, 45. Do I hear 40, 35, 30? All the way down to, 5? 10? Something like that. Abraham gets really, really low, and God just gives away the farm each time. God's not interested in any bargaining. God says, yep, I'll do it. The matter is settled in God's way, not in the manner Abraham envisions. Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, and Lot's wife meets an unusual end. The loss of his wife leaves Lot with 2 daughters, but no sons. And his daughters take matters into their own hands to resolve the issue of male offspring. They get their father drunk, have sex with him, and become pregnant by him. And each bears a son, the progenitors of the eventually hated and despised Moabites and Ammonites. Interesting modern day research, actually. I read about this recently. It's something that happened in 2018. So just 3 years ago now. A research project was finally published of an archaeological dig that was going on around the Dead Sea over in the Middle East. And in the digging and the research, you hear about this? Stop me if you've heard it. They unearthed some broken pottery shards that on one side were like melted, glazed so that it was, halfway melted. The other side was fine. How they could explain that was an interesting exercise in trying to reverse engineer their way back to, okay, how could this have happened? And the only explanation is really a supercharged moment of heat, extreme heat, that they could only explain by some kind of an explosion in the atmosphere, like a meteorite coming to the earth and exploding in that area. And of course, people who read the Bible say, here we go. We've had this for a long time. Yeah, it's one that supports this story, definitely. And it's from about the same time frame, about 3,000 years ago is when they dated it. And it would be in the correct region. So I just thought that was insanely cool. And, whether this story is, actually what literally happened, or whether, the people saw this moment and put the pieces together, it's just really cool that, that moment could live on in the memory of people in this way, that they had to give it meaning, find the meaning, find the purpose in it. So just interesting stuff.
It's on here, we talk about all the sexual improprieties that go on nowadays, and yet you look back here in Genesis 18 and 19, this stuff was all going on back then.
Yes.
The sleeping with the father, the father and the son thing. It's...
We have the Puritans to thank for a lot. And their approach to their attitude towards sexuality is one of those things. And yeah, it's led to, kind of a unique attitude. You go to other places in the world and their regard for just sexuality is not the same way that we have in the United States, in our culture. And that got onto a different track than talking about sexual immorality and rape and incest and all that. And that's not what I was talking about. But no, it's all over the place in there. And that is not to justify it. That's not to give it any standing as being allowed or anything like that. That's not what it is. But that's the way the world was, and it still is in many places. All right. I'll skip over number 20 because it's kind of a repeat of the Egypt episode, only this time it's King Abimelech who comes in. Genesis 21, finally the child of promise, Isaac, is born. Genesis chapter 22 is the story of when God calls Abraham to now give back the child that had been promised, to offer him as a sacrifice. And that location, that spot, Mount Moriah, the second paragraph in Genesis 22 there. Later Jewish writers link to the Mount of Sacrifice to the threshing floor which David bought from Araunah the Jebusite. That's something I mentioned yesterday morning, on which Solomon built the Jerusalem temple. So it is a very significant geographical location. But also, Islam teaches that Ishmael, not Isaac, was the one being prepared for sacrifice on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, where the Islamic shrine, the Dome of the Rock, now stands. So there's all kinds of strings attached to that spot. It's some kind of a hot spot on the planet that is very important, not only to Judaism and Christianity, but also to Islam as well. All right. Let's wrap this up. Genesis 23. When Sarah dies at the age of 127, Abraham is 137 years old. Isaac is 37 years old. Although apparently the inhabitants of Canaan have permitted Abraham to live among them, he is still a wandering nomad and needs a place to bury his deceased wife. So he approaches the local citizens to buy a cave. They respond by paying him compliments about being a mighty prince and assure him that he can have any sepulcher he wants and all for nothing. But Abraham has in mind one particular burial place, the cave of Machpelah, located in present-day Hebron, and asks for permission to buy it at a fair price from its owner, Ephron the Hittite. Ephron now enters into the negotiations. He's willing to part with the cave, but he also insists on including the surrounding field in the deal, the first package deal in biblical history. Naturally, there is loud talk about giving the cave and the field to Abraham. I give you the field, I give you the cave. Abraham is willing to increase the size of his proposed purchase, but insists on preserving his oriental dignity by paying for the property. Ephron's reply is beautiful. A piece of land worth a mere 400 shekels of silver? What is that between you and me? Ephron has now let Abraham know how much he wants for the cave and the land. Abraham agrees to the price, weighs it out, hands it over, and the land and the cave are his. Abraham now owns part of the promised land, even if it is only a small corner, and even if it is bought for a price rather than given freely by God. That burial cave becomes the final resting place of Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. And then there's a note about how that kind of a transaction still takes place even today in the Middle East, with those kinds of phrases being used. And we'll wrap it up there. There's some more details about Abraham's life. He has a second wife, Keturah, dies at the age of 175, is buried by Isaac and Ishmael together. But we will stop my talking. I've done a lot of talking. Do you have any questions or thoughts? Anything you are interested in, wondering about, surprised by, or any of the above? If anything at all.
It was just quite an interesting life when you read this about Abraham and you really go through it.
It does a good job of kind of preserving the sense of what that culture would have been like.
Was the name changed just to reflect that Abraham and Sarah were now God's chosen?
Which one was that?
Genesis 17.
Yes. Abram means exalted ancestor. Abraham means ancestor of a multitude. So it just adds the ham onto the end of it, and that just means father of many. So Abram means exalted father. Abraham means father of many. So God is kind of just doubling down on this promise. That's the significance there. Good question. Anything else?
Well, then, I assume that the practice of circumcision came in to distinguish clean from unclean, or holy from unholy, or what?
It is a way, as this curriculum really kind of lifted up, of marking your family. You know, this is how you produce your children. Your, not to be crass about it, but your baby maker is now marked. It's a way of, it's connected very much to God's promise of family, of a great nation coming from Abraham. And there's a lot of significance that's tied to that whole idea right there. But definitely it would distinguish men, one from another, circumcised versus uncircumcised, especially in the Roman era. of public bathing. There's some other interesting stories that might come up next week about who was it? Like Judah, who, after something happened with his sister, Judah told the men of that tribe that they needed to be circumcised now. And while they were still recovering the next morning, Judah and his brothers went in and killed all of them. That's neither here nor there, really, but it just came to mind for me for some reason. But yeah, good question. Anything else? It is 8 o'clock. So for our live stream